That's me. I'm a Tartan historian. I'm also the Honorary Head of Research and Collections for the Scottish Tartans Authority. I'm going to talk to you about a huge subject in about half an hour. Can't possibly go anywhere near the depth of this. My background, I grew up with tartan. My father was an anthropologist specialising in Highlands, textiles, etc. I'm also a weaver, so I came to a lot of my study from understanding or wanting to understand how the cloth was constructed, and therefore linking in with some of these historical precedents, trying to preserve some of the older techniques, etc., which we have lost, almost lost, due to commercialisation. Roddy asked me to talk about Jacobite tartans. Actually, of course, there is no such thing as a Jacobite tartan. What there are surviving tartans of the Jacobite era. Slight difference. They weren't unique to the Jacobites, although the Jacobites did garner or desire to use them. We'll talk about tartans of the Jacobite era. And just to set this in context, because of course it's not just about the 45, which we often think about, but as early as 1707 there are reports of ladies in Edinburgh choosing to use tartan as a symbol of their anti-union beliefs. So not Highland textile. Tartan had, certainly by 1700, become if you like, a Scottish phenomenon. It was widely exported, even at this early stage, also used as a symbol of Scottishness, not just by the Highlanders, and therefore not just by the Jacobites, linking obviously with the Act of Union and Scottish identity as opposed to Highland or Jacobitism. And in fact, the earliest surviving examples we've got of the wider use of tartan outside the Highlands are the Royal Company of Archers. Royal Company of Archers given their royal title by Queen Anne, and in 1715 they adopted a new tartan uniform. Said to be the Royal Stuart, it's not. We know because it survives. There are 4 surviving uniforms, hugely complex tartan, probably produced in Edinburgh, so again not produced in the Highlands. Symbol of, again, Scottish identity as opposed to being Jacobite supporters. Bear in mind that most of the lairds that formed the Royal Company of Archers were lowland lairds at that time from Edinburgh and the borders. So, tartan and the Jacobite cause. David, fortunately, has stolen already some of my sandwiches when he mentioned the Duke of Perth providing suits of tartan clothes, Highland clothes, for Charles Edward Stuart and his brother in the 1730s, something like that. Great shame they don't survive, but as David said, textiles generally don't survive. Of the approximately 10,000 tartans that I now have on record, I could probably date to pre-1800 about 100. There was 150 perhaps if I was lucky, and actually to the period of the 45, probably no more than about 40, something like that. So huge proliferation, very few of them survive. The ones that do survive we tend to find is either small fragments or portraits. Marvellous, fantastic outfit. 3 different pieces of tartan. So we have a plaid in one complex tartan, the jacket, and then the top part of the trews, which you can't see in here, is in the 3rd tartan. I would actually call this fancy dress. It's Jacobite fancy dress. It is not practical everyday wear of the Jacobites, but it's, if you like, of that theme. It's supporting what they do. But it's a fantastic piece, made in 1744, possibly in Edinburgh or Glasgow. All natural dyes, just shows, tells a lie to some of the ideas that natural dyes were bland, dull, etc. Red, very important colour, widely used by the gentry, not just in tartan, but across everything that they could possibly wear. An expensive imported dye, so you're making a social statement by wearing lots of red. Perth, it was he who gave the suits and indeed the Taj and the sword you saw earlier to Charles and Henry. But again, the idea of where we see the use of tartan, it was the Duke of Perth who encouraged Charles to have some, if you like, coordinating symbol for his army, for his cause, and the symbol that he lucked on, if you like, was tartan. So everybody was encouraged to wear tartan as a symbol of their support for him. And you see this being worn not just by Highland gentry, but people from the lowlands, people from overseas as well, who were supporting the Jacobite cause, were encouraged to wear tartan as a symbol of their support. So it became identifiable, if you like, as a Jacobite symbol, if you like, in lowercase. As himself, probably not painted from life, but the only portrait we have of him in tartan. Lord George Murray, so one of his, if not his greatest general, wearing tartan. Again, just that symbol of, you see Murray wearing tartan, if you see the larger version of the picture behind, all of the other clan gentry behind wearing tartan and wearing Highland dress in their case. Compare and contrast this outfit, the one that's behind, with that of Hind Cotton. What we've got here is a practical, if you like, Highland cut, rural use of clothing, a practical use for warfighting, etc., rather than the fancy dress I described earlier. Murray Threepland, so again, another Jacobite. Lots of these gentry being painted in tartan outfits as a symbol of their identity, of their Scottishness. As we'll see later, not just the Jacobites. Duke of Perth, wearing probably a European jacket, and again, but a tartan plaid, identifying him as not only Scottish, but also a Jacobite. Women, of course, wore tartan as well. It wasn't just men. Lots of discussion about who this is. I think it's probably likely to have been one of the Murray daughters, Amelia, or the other daughters. The tartan, one of the few tartans that we know today or use today as a clan tartan, which we can actually trace back to the 45. So of those 40 odd tartans I talked about that are now used generally as clan tartans, I probably wouldn't fit them on one hand. That's Murray of Tullibardine. You can actually take a piece of Murray of Tullibardine and match every line in that portrait by Cosmo Alexander. A very fine example and an early example of an accurate rendition of tartan. Tartan being one of the most difficult things that artists, particularly those who've never seen the thing or don't understand it, have difficulty in replicating. His daughter, Jenny Cameron, again wearing a tartan screen or shawl, little cartouche here of Charles Edward Stuart. Again, double, if you like, treble symbols here. We have tartan, we have the little picture of Charles Edward Stuart, and of course the white rose you see here as well. So combinations of both tartan and the white rose as Jacobite iconography. Picture of Peter MacDonald, again wearing tartan, white Jacobite rose at the top here. So it's not just men but also women. You'll notice they're not wearing, the women of this period are not wearing the dreadful outline type outfits that you see people wearing, which are a reimagination of McKeon from the 1840s. And of course the very famous portrait of Flora MacDonald. Again, here we see, painted in London, but here we see the rose, what the rose is, and the tartan symbol here. Interesting that this tartan here is again Murray of Tullibardine. So we've now got two period portraits of the period by artists, both wearing Murray of Tullibardine. This one by Ramsay, of course, and Ramsay painted 3 other paintings, all of which the subject is wearing Murray of Tullibardine tartan. Strongly suggests that he had a piece of Murray of Tullibardine tartan. Ramsay very good at features like hands and faces, but he would then put out the furniture and other bits and pieces to one of his juniors. But it's very clear that the Tullibardine tartan was a piece that he must have had, because it's replicated. Again, this one you can trace every line in there to a piece of Tullibardine tartan, line by line. So again, very, very good examples. An unusual portrait, what was at one time have been a bigger portrait, almost certainly Helen Murray Bock attire, again, lots of tartan. Her mother was a rabid Jacobite. Said that she covered her whole boudoir in everything tartan. Jacobite rose here. Her father was a Hanoverian officer who was captured at Prestonhams This is about 1750, so just after the 45. This rose is right on the edge of the frame now, so I suspect originally it was a much larger portrait, probably had her father in here, I suspect, and was cut down at a later stage because it probably wasn't very politically savvy to have yourself associated, particularly the Hanoverian officer, with the opposition. And as I said, Tartan was not just a Jacobite symbol. Here's the Earl of Loudon, John Campbell, Earl of Loudon. He is wearing, yes, you've got it, the Murray of Tullibardine tartan. Another portrait by Allen. It's interesting, this is said to be his regimentals, and a lot of people were terribly excited and said, so this is what his regiment, 64th or Loudon Highlanders, wore. No, they didn't. This was done, his regimentals refer to certainly his coat, but that's about it. It's said that the flag was woven possibly by his lover or his wife. I'm not sure if that's true, or that it was simply that Ramsay had a piece of tartan, which when the Earl of Loudon wanted to appear Scottish and reinforce those credentials, he needed tartan, and so Ramsay again used the piece that he had. Here's actually the regimental piece of the tartan that the regiment was used. This piece, dated 1746, is in a letter now, unfortunately, in a museum in California. But this was sent to him by an agent in Edinburgh for his approval and acceptance. So a very rare example, slightly off topic, but that is the oldest surviving piece of military tartan by quite a long way. It's what we would now call very like the cloud. It's not what we would, later became the Bailey tartan. Interesting for a number of reasons. In terms of material culture, you can see his little zigzag at the bottom here. That's very like a herringbone selvage, which you get a lot of old pieces of cloth, but in fact it's a chevron wreath, which is very, very unusual. So, a really important piece. I would love to get that back in this country. Not only is there does that piece survive, but actually there's a piece of the hose cloth as well that was sent to Loudon in the same letter. Norman MacLeod, 22nd Chief of the MacLeods, Member of Parliament for Inverness, a rabid Hanoverian, but painted by Ramsay in tartan to cement his Scottish credentials, wearing a simple outfit of Rob Roy, and the museum on the National Gallery has a sketch of this in, if you like, plain non-tartan clothes that Ramsay did for the portrait, and then he added tartan to it. So it's a simple Rob Roy check, and then applied in what tartan? Yes, you've got it. It's Murray of Tullibardine, same artist, same tartan. Again, add some tartan to it. Notice with all of these, again, we're using a lot of red because you're creating a social, providing a social statement. If you like, check me out, look at me, I'm really wealthy because I can afford lots of red. Charles Edward Stuart, like with so many other things, he was apt to be given pieces of tartan, which he would then, when he went somewhere else, pass them on to somewhere else. They employed a totemic, iconic piece of material culture that linked him with the individuals, reinforced, bonded, etc. There are a number of these pieces that survive. When they come up for sale, Colin can attest, they now command quite substantial prices. There are far more bits of tartan that Bonnie Prince Charlie wore or touched than there are bits of the True Cross. There are quite a lot of them which have a provenance attached to them which doesn't survive very detailed examination. It's quite clear that a lot of them are somewhat later. However, there are some original pieces that survive. So here's one. This piece, and there is a larger piece which is in the Carlisle Museum. Carlisle Museum contacted me, 20, 30 years ago now. They were reupholstering an 18th century chair. They took off the upholstery, and underneath was another cover of tartan, which was a larger piece of this. An interesting piece of cloth, narrow width, joined together. It comes from this house, Ellen Grange, which is just outside Carlisle, which is where Charles Edward Stuart spent the night whilst this Carlisle was under siege. He allegedly slept under this plaid. He then gave it to the owners of the house by way of thanks. And it just shows the totemic nature of that. What so often happens with these pieces of tartan, unlike canteen sets, etc., is that they get cut up. Because, again, like bits of the True Cross, if you could just have a fragment of it, you've got a piece that you know who touched. And therefore, it's how you spread the word, how you reinforce support over time. Another one, this was a plaid which he wore at the, it's alleged to have worn at the ball in Holyrood, which he gave to Lady Hamilton, Countess of Eglinton, beg your pardon. She had 7 daughters, and she gave a piece of it to each of the 7 daughters. 2 of the daughters then had fragments mounted up. This one, I think, is the one that's in Culloden, the National Trust Museum. There's also one in one of the castles in Aberdeenshire. Duff House, thank you. Almost the same. Again, what you see here is the fragments. It's quite difficult when these pieces are cut up, because quite often the pattern is quite large, and when someone does this to them, trying to recreate or repiece the pieces, in order to preserve that weaving technique, those patterns, that piece of history, can be extraordinarily difficult. And there's quite a lot of work you need to do. Modern photographic techniques are great because you can take each of these pieces out and you can rotate them and move them together, etc. But quite often there's just simply not enough of it to allow us to recreate the pattern. Again, pieces that have a totemic nature. This is the so-called MacDonald of Kingsborough tartan, taken from a waistcoat that Charles Edward Stuart was given, or wore, that he then, being too bright, looking too much like a gentleman, he gave to MacDonald of Kingsborough, who before, well, it was given by Kingsborough to Charles, who then gave it to a servant called MacLeod. MacLeod was about to be captured in 1746, so he hid it in the cleft of a rock. MacLeod was imprisoned for a year for supporting the Jacobites, Charles Edward Stuart. When he came back, that was all that was left. I find it hard to believe that that's all that was left after a year of exposure, and it's remarkable how a year of exposure allowed it to rot in a perfect rectangle. So again, it's a piece that has been cut up. Oh, what happened to the rest of it? And again, there is probably just enough of that to allow it to be reconstructed, but it's often quite difficult. In the intervening years, and certainly at the end of the not the last century, now the end of the 19th century, a number of books were published, particularly a book called Old and Rare Scottish Tartans, which sought to reproduce a lot of these old patterns that had not hitherto been seen. It's quite interesting. I've just finished a piece of work looking at all of the tartans in that and comparing them with the pieces that they cite as the source, and they're often quite different. So this is an example. MacDonald of Borrowdale, that's the piece at Stonyhurst College. Again, a plaid given by Lady MacDonald of Borrowdale, McGregor, to Charles Edward Stuart when he left the mainland to go to Benbeckett and beyond. Interesting because it is plain weave, unlike modern twill weave, so it's 1 over 1 under, so a less dense cloth, normally something much more associated with women's wear. Described as she gave him a suit of Highland clothes, but we don't actually know what that means. So was it a cloak, was it a coat, we don't know. This, David talks about, if you like, the provenance, tracking the provenance. This piece is one for which there is pretty good provenance, insofar as we know that it was given to a man in Skypipe, Island Glass, just off the coast of Raasay, and it survived almost intact until the end of the 19th century, when he started cutting it up and giving it to people, or selling it to people. He says, I've now tracked down 3 pieces of this. The National Museum has a very small piece. There is a piece in the Fort William Museum there as well. But again, by combining the 3 of them, you can then reconstruct the pattern. Ronnie, that's your piece. Piece cut from probably a jacket or something like that, small piece here. Again, a piece given to Charles Edward Stuart, apparently said to have been woven, spun and woven by Lady MacDonald of Keppoch. It would be fantastic to find where all the other bits of these things are, and I think David also mentioned that pieces are there's so much more to discover. Things are always coming out of the woodwork, but from working with these types of pieces, it allows us to reconstruct things, and it also allows us to challenge some of the existing assumptions and knowledge. There's a piece of, we talked about MacDonald Kingsborough earlier, so here is that fragment reconstructed against a piece of the whole tartan. If any of you know the MacDonald Kingsborough tartan, it's a bright red and green thing with yellow lines on, except it's not when you then go back to the original source documents. And here, the Borrowdale, we talked about that. There's your piece from Stonyhurst, I think. No, that's the piece from Fort William. That's the piece from Stonyhurst, and this is a piece from the National Museum. But again, by rotating and combining them, you can then reconstruct the patterns. Quite a painstaking and difficult process, but one, if you have enough of the pieces, or the piece is large enough, you can do it with 100% accuracy. What it does is gives us an insight into the types of patterns that existed at the time. As I say, of the 10,000 odd tartans now, we're probably at less than 50 that we can date that survive from that period. This one, a bit like the Loudon one, is unusual in that it doesn't have a lot of red in it. Of course, the tartans, and I'll show you some, the majority that survive are red-based tartans. They're red-based tartans because they're more expensive, they therefore belong to the gentry who can afford things not to wear every day and wear them to death. So common people's clothing, like anything else that was used by common people in general, doesn't survive. But this is perhaps something, example, use of red, just to lift the pattern. You're saying that, well, I can afford some red, but not entirely red. There's Ronnie's piece, and then again restructured against the whole of, reconstructed against the whole of the tartan. So you can see how, with a bit of jiggery pokery, you can then work out what the patterns are. Point of note here is we often think of tartans now having as red being a strong red colour, whereas in the past any shade of red was good, because again you were using red and making a statement. People didn't, it depended on the quality of the dye stuff, how much dye stuff you had, and the nature of the mordant, the fixatant. So in order to get a good scarlet, you need a tin mordant. Very, very difficult to get in the 18th century, certainly in the rural Highlands. Whereas a pinky colour you can easily get from the use of either pewter raspings, which are only 10% tin, or indeed alum or something like that. Story slightly off topic, and I've got a piece here, but I did the advice for the tartans for the film Rob Roy many years ago, and I took down some pieces, and I had a piece that's associated with the McGregor that has a red that's not similar to this shade here. And the costume advice, this is fantastic, it's brilliant, you know, you've got a piece that links to Rob Roy, etc., but we can't use it. Why is that? Well, the director won't have Liam Neeson wearing pink. It's not pink, it's red. So just, you know, there's only so much you can do in historical reenactments, depending on where you go. Perhaps in tartan, if you like, academic circles, the most famous of the surviving pieces is the so-called Muir Hall plaid. So this is the plaid that was given by Charles Edward Stuart to Anne Mackintosh, Colonel Anne Mackintosh, following the successful rout of Muir. So he had been staying with her in February 1746, when government troops sought to surprise them. She sent out her retainers, a smaller number of them, created a big fuss, scared away a larger force. As a form of thanks, he gave her this plaid. There are probably 20 or 30 pieces of this that survive, except they don't, because we know that the plaid was copied in about 1800, and again in about 1820, and again in about 1830, and some of those pieces now turn up as pieces of the original. And it's really difficult. I mean, some of them are very obviously different because they have different size patterns or different colours or shades of colours, but some of them are very, very close. and trying to tell one from other is quite difficult. Unlike silver, tartan isn't hallmarked, so you can only tell how old a piece of tartan is by a lot of experience, by comparing. You can certainly do dye analysis of the dye stuffs, which will tell you within broad areas whether something is 18th century or late 18th century or whatever. But other than that, you've got to look for techniques in the production of the yarn, the dyeing techniques, the weaving techniques, etc. So I'd say about 30 pieces of this I have found. That is the surviving piece that's still held by the family up in Muir Hall. You can see the size of it. So this was a complete lad. She died in 1788. I am pretty certain it was Anne Mackintosh who cut it up and divvied it out amongst her family and Jacobite supporters. She had no direct descendants. It went down to her husband's cousin, and then the next generation went down a cousin separately. There's also a piece of a very similar pattern up at Braemar Castle, which of course is where Caroline's father, she was a Farquharson by birth. But an interesting piece, that is, you can see how long it is, 23 inches. What we don't have, and again it's been cut up, what we don't have, we've got one complete selvage here, so that's the edge. This end is a frayed edge. And so we do not know, and of all the 30 odd pieces that I have looked at, I have never found this side here. So one has to speculate and work out what size you think the pattern was in the way it finishes. But there are all sorts of conundrums about this piece. Little fragments, that's the piece at Fort William or Inverness, I can't remember which. Again, piece cut up, put in a little locket here. You can see the shades there quite different to this, the coarseness of the weave quite different to this, etc. So that's an original piece. This is not an original piece, it's a copy. This is a piece at the National Museum, which, I'm sorry David, but it's not part of the original. And how do I know? And this is one of the beauties of this piece, and where you start getting into the real detail. This piece, if you like, has the equivalent of a hallmark. This is the original piece, and the selvage section. It has 7 bars of herringboning, and within that herringboning there is a dropped thread right at the beginning here, and the first bar runs in the opposite direction. So you can see all these threads are running, if you like, bottom right up to top left, and this first bar here, and I've got this piece with me, runs the opposite direction. This is the piece at the National Museum, and this is also the same as the piece in the Inverness Museum. There are 8 bars, and the first bar runs in the same direction as the main body. You know, whichever way you turn it, cut it up, you cannot make 7 into 8, and you cannot make the threads run the other way. So those have to be 2 different pieces of cloth. There are other bits about it as well. One of these small examples where you can actually take a piece that has provenance, the family still own it, and then look at the pieces. If you have a piece came up for auction, which I was fortunate to purchase, that has this side of the piece of cloth on, if you've got that fault in it and the 7 bars, you can tell it's part of the original. So of those 30 odd pieces, I think I'm now on to about 12 that I know are parts of the original cloth. And it would be fantastic one day to bring them all together as part of a combined exhibition. So, what do we know about Jacobite tartans? This portrait is well known. It is our source material. What's interesting about it from, if you like, a tartan perspective, said to have been used Jacobite prisoners from the Holts in Silbury, who allegedly were given the clothes to put on rather than being their clothes. We're looking at the front line of a Jacobite charge, so we're looking at the gentry. We can assume that Morier painted roughly what he saw in front of him. So we have kilts, we have filabeds, we have trews, we have jackets, we have a mixture of tartans, mostly red tartans, but some red and blue tartans, red and green tartans, etc. What we cannot be certain is whether that individual wore that combination on the day, or whether he was given them for the portrait. That's what we don't know. But it gives you an idea of the cut of the clothes, and if you like, the types of patterns. none of them, because there were no such things as clan tartans at that time. While people look at that and go, well, that's very like McGregor tartan. Well, it is, but McGregor tartans are red and green tartans, so yeah, it looks red and green. It's a tiny portrait for those who know it, or picture. It's yay big, so there's not a lot of detail in that, unlike some of the others we've looked at. Just to put this in context, because this is where a lot of the myth surrounding tartan has developed. Tartan, of course, is in terms of cultural or Jacobite artifacts, is probably the item that has spurned the most, the greatest breadth of modern reproductions, etc. Accurate description, often cited as the fact that tartan was banned after Culloden. It was not. This does not ban tartan. Nowhere in there does it ban tartan. What it does is tell you that you cannot put on, here we are, no tartan or partly coloured plaid or stuff should be used for greatcoats or uppercoats. Nowhere in there does it say you can't wear tartan as a whole. You'll also notice that in here it talks about no man or boy. So therefore it doesn't exclude women. So if women can wear tartan, how can tartan be banned? And in fact, when you read the letters or correspondence at the time of the army trying to enforce this, and it took them 3 years to bring this in, them constantly writing to the judges saying, well, exactly what does it mean by plaid, and the judges interpreting it in their own right. And certainly by the time we get to the repeal in 1782, there's no mention of tartan at all. It just says you can put on all these clothes again. It doesn't mention tartan at all. So just an important reference point, probably the greatest myth surrounding tartan, apart from everybody had a clan tartan when they came out of the Ark, is that tartan was banned after Culloden. It was not. So we talked about portraits, we've talked about fragments. Generally that's all we have nowadays surviving, because as I just showed you, Highland clothes were banned. So surviving examples of period costume in tartan are extremely rare. The hind cotton outfit, because of course it belonged to an English Jacobite, could be worn in London to parties for it didn't ban him from wearing it in London, and indeed that outfit has been quite well worn. So looking at it, I would suggest it was worn for a number of events before, during and after the 45. So of these are allegedly 4 surviving coats. That one there, the so-called Culloden coat in Kelvin Grove Museum, is source of the Culloden tartan. It's perhaps the best known one. This one, interesting one, it's one of 2 in the National Museum. I know the background behind it, I know the story behind it, but actually the cut and the style and the cloth is all early 19th century. So whilst I understand, and you see this quite often, it's the family, once they are 3 or 4 generations removed from the event, 100 years, believe something that is old, therefore must be even older, whereas it's not. So having examined it, having done dye analysis, which unfortunately they lost, I am pretty certain that is probably 1820. This one, in private collection, said to have belonged to an equerry to Charles Edward Stuart. It's from Forfarshire and still within the same family. Quite a simple coat, but some beautiful features about it. And then this one, part of only 2 complete suits, the other one being the hind cotton. So this one has a pair of trews associated with it. This one was on display in the United Services Museum, as was in the 1970s, then disappeared, went back into private collection. I tracked it down about 3 or 4 years ago now, and those who went to the Wild Majestic exhibition 3 years ago will have seen it there. There are some interesting features about it. So there is a picture from Telford Dunbar's book of the history of Highland dress. That's actually the outfit. Some fascinating things about this. I've just finished a paper on this. I am pretty certain that this is of the period. It is said to have been the outfit that Charles Edward Stuart wore at Culloden. Whether it was or was not, I know there are various descriptions of him, his outfit being covered in blood and mud, so that would suggest it's not that one. Telford Dunbar thought it was for a boy of about 5 foot. Actually, I reckon it fits someone about 5'9". So it could have been a prince, quite narrow, but bearing in mind the prince, as we shall hear later, was a relatively slight young man at the time. But there are a number of features about this outfit which date it to the period. Wholly the construction. So Telford Dunbar looked at this and said, oh, this tartan is typical of what you saw in the 1820s. Well, it's like that, but actually you find older examples as well. The thing about the 1820s, so the period of the Highland Revival, is none of the examples, either in portraiture or extant examples from that period, is retrospective. The whole cut and style of this coat is mid-18th century, down to the construction of the buttons. So it has 33 silver bone buttons with a silver cap, featuring the Jacobite rose, the death head buttons that are used on the trews, the cut of the trews, the quality of the cloth, everything about this suggests that it is 18th century. Hoping to get this back up on Rome for an exhibition at V&A next year. Very much a quick run through tartan. I could talk to you for all day about how tartan was woven, the structure of tartan, how to tell the difference between an 18th century, a 19th century and a 20th century piece of tartan. I brought some pieces to show you, which I will, as I say, perhaps just talk about some. One of the things that you see a lot in 18th century pieces of cloth, particularly ones that are used for climbing, etc., was the edge or the selvage was herringbone. It's typical of a lot of pieces of the time. So I've got a piece here that is herringbone, which I can show you later. I talked about the piece that the Muir Hall plaid. There is a piece, the other piece, so this combined piece is the largest piece of the Muir Hall plaid, other than that that's still at Muir Hall. It has the seven herringbone bars on it, and indeed the drop thread on the edge. So that's how I know that it's of the same cut as the piece at still within the family. So lots of very different pieces of tartan. So the majority of them are red-based, because people were wanting to, if you like, cement their social status. But red was a very broad and mixed item. So there's a piece of certainly first half 18th century cloth, a much darker, chunkier red, and then the piece that Liam Nielsen wasn't allowed to wear. This was associated with McGregor's, again very pinky red because of the mordant or the fixative that was used to fix that red. So again, just to if you like, emphasise that colour was important, i.e. red was an important colour, but the quality of colour was dependent entirely on your purse. The fact that patterns, many of the patterns that we see today, had very little bearing on what was woven in the 18th century. So the styles and techniques of the 18th century have almost entirely been lost. The use of herringbone selvages has now been, if you like, woven out due to commercial pressures, the types of looms, etc. It is possible to get it done. So what I'm wearing is a reconstruction of a mid-18th century piece of tartan, recently done by Lochcarron. They replicated, I had to do all the design work for them, but they have replicated an original mid-18th century piece of cloth, matching the shades and also including a herringbone selvage. So it can still be done, and these are the things that make a piece of tartan unique and if you like, significant, rather than just being run of the mill. Very happy to take any questions. As I say, I could talk forever about tartan. Look later.
I, as much as I had assumed at all, I assumed the ubiquity of red was because it was cheap, although, as in, you know, they always say that the British Army's red coats were done in red because that was the cheapest dye.
Well, there are two sources of red for British Army red coats. Most of them, so the soldiers, the non-officers' coats were dyed with madder. which was a cheap dye stuff, never fades. It's like the red equivalent of saffron. Saffron was actually very expensive, but it fades. Whereas the officers would wear cloth dyed with cochineal because they paid for their cloth. So red dyes, and a lot of the pieces, surviving pieces, have been examined spectrographically by the National Museum and some of their associated colleagues, and I think something like 99.99% of the reds are cochineal. So an imported dye stuff. Cochineal was coming into Scotland from about 1700, going around but very much the rigor colour.
Every day at school then.
Are these all one piece?
Yes, they are.
So right down to
Right
the
down
shoes,
to
over
feet.
the shoes, under the shoes?
They were worn probably with boots. So
Right.
true is classic for equestrian use. And one of the things I thought about this, if this was original, then you would expect to see some sort of damage or staining from probably horse riding. And you can't see it here, but actually all around here is a staining that you might get from saddle soap or something like that that's still on them. And it would be very fascinating to have that actually examined. No more. Good. If you want to have a look at some of these over lunchtime, please do.
Thanks very much, Peter.